In the grim darkness of the present, there are too many paints. But I am here to shed some light upon that subject. I'm Khan, and you're watching The Wrath of Minis. There's a lot of paint in this world. Tons of choices, things to pick from, and the question and part of it is which ones? But also, when picking paints, what kind of paints are there? What's available to us? What do we want to choose from? And all of those questions kind of lead to is like, what is paint? And what are the things that I need to be aware of when choosing paint? Paint is a medium, something that we apply generally in a liquid form that applies or creates a sort of a hard film that has color on it, which we apply to, say, our models. But obviously, in fine art and things like that, there'll be, canvases. Understanding paint, and very briefly, this isn't going to be a science class of any kind, where we are dealing with a pigment and then a medium. In our line of the hobby, acrylic paint is the most common thing. And a medium for acrylic paint is acrylic mixed with a variety of other things, binders, filler, water, that kind of stuff that creates the medium which the pigment sits in. Once blended fully, you get paint that we kind of know how to utilize, or that's what we get in our bottles. And this applies to oils and enamels and various other kind of things. Paint has different levels of sheen. There's a sort of range or a gamut that exists from sort of very matte to glossy. And different paint ranges, and probably within the same company, have different levels of just those things, how matte and how shiny. And finding the right paint for what you're looking for is an important element about how we paint. A lot of the professional painters utilize very matte paint, but there is also a case to utilizing glossy stuff. And for instance, if we look at here, my shirt is very matte, or it has a lack of shine to it, whereas my skin might have a layer of just a little bit of sheen, whereas my eye has a high level of gloss to it in comparison because it's a bit of water. So different elements have different levels of this, of this range. And so if you're looking to create real realism, and that's not necessarily for everyone, different paints can help you get there. A quick thing when it comes to paints as well is there's different levels of viscosity or fluidity to them. Some of them can be heavy body acrylic, which can almost be utilized as a texture, versus things that are like ink that flow very rapidly or very fast, and they work very differently, or they have a very different feel. And that's something that you're going to have to sort of keep in the back of your head. Also, paints have different levels of opacity, meaning that they will cover something much more easily rather than having to apply multiple layers or levels of transparency. And those are other things that you will have to take into account whilst painting. Certain colors do not work well over other colors because of transparency or lack of opacity. Just again, things that are part of the painting realm that you're going to have to keep in the back of your mind, but also learn as you go along, because you don't necessarily know those things up front, and only through practice do you get that kind of level of understanding that's required whilst painting. So there are a variety of different mediums that people use for miniature painting. The most common is acrylic, though there is oil and enamel and inks. There are pigment paints and other various more specialty paints that are out there. But for the vast majority, practically everyone, and even the pros, are utilizing acrylic paints. Acrylic paint is partly, firstly, inexpensive in comparison to the variety of other paints that are out there. It's not necessarily cheap, but it's cheaper than those. It's got great vibrancy to those paints. It dries quickly, which means you don't have to wait around to continue painting. It's also quite durable. So if you're playing it for like war games or board games or any of those things, or things where you're using it more frequently by touch, acrylic is hardier than a variety of the other ones that are out there, meaning that it's a good choice for just those things. Also, it's water soluble, so it's something that we can just use the water from our tap and mix it. That makes it very easy, whereas like oils and enamels require a mixture of a different type of chemical like turpentine or odorless or white mineral spirit. And It's also not toxic. Different pigments out there can be toxic, but for the acrylic and for the most majority, they are not. And so that means for the, paintbrush lickers out there, you're okay. Another type of paint that you're going to see out there in the miniature world are going to be oils and enamel paints. These are used, but they're not used by the vast majority of painters out there. Acrylic still holds that. But there is a case to be made for these other things. There are a couple of things we should also note about it. Because it's oil and enamel, they are not water-based. So that means you can't use your tap. You have to use a type of mineral spirit of some kind in order to use them properly. Also, their paints tend to take a longer time to dry, meaning that you have more working time, which can be nice in terms of, saying, like blending and things, but it also takes longer for them to dry before you can apply another layer to them, otherwise causing the blending, which you might not want to have. So it's definitely, oil exists much more in the fine arts world of things, and there are definitely times and places to use it in the miniature realm, but it tends to be used more for an effect rather than used it as a means to paint from start to finish. A lot of people, including myself, will tend to work in an acrylic-based form and then maybe add a little bit of oil or enamel for an effect that we're looking for. There are some really cool things about them. For instance, with enamel effects like from AK Interactive, you can get rust and you can get grime and you can get slime effects that you can add to it, which is a really neat way of adding realism to your model without having to individually pick little things out with your paintbrush, or you can do it, almost use it as a wash. You also find with oils that you can do something like called an oil wash, which is a nice way of creating detail or putting emphasis into the recesses of a model so it gives you better definition. So there are interesting things you can do with it, but predominantly we stick with acrylic. So next up, we're going to talk about inks. Very hyperfluid acrylic paint. It almost works like a glaze, allowing you to see the detail underneath it, but having real vibrancy, so really changing the color. Not only that, but it's also very glossy, it has a tendency. So ink is more of a niche product. It can be used, and it's interesting because it allows you to change the temperatures in certain places, but it also allows you to change the level of sheen that exists. And so certain materials, for instance, like leather, can have a level of matteness in a certain place and a level of shine in another. And so it can create depth and nuance on your model, but it's not for everyone, and I would definitely not recommend it starting. Don't start with inks. God, no. Next up is pigment paints. Now, pigment paints is not something that you're going to paint your model with. Let's just start there. You could try, but I just don't think it's going to come out well at all. Pigment paints is effectively a dry powder form that you can apply, and it tends to be best used on terrain or diorama stuff. It can be quite strong in its color. There's a whole skew of different colors out there, just like there's anything else. And it tends to be dry and leave kind of like marks along. So it's a great tool to apply colors in certain places, and leave kind of like a textural form after it. But it's also, it can also come off and get knocked off quite easily, meaning it's not very useful for the model, but nice in terrain. And so if you're looking for different colors, different ways of applying that, dry pigment could be a cool thing to test out. There are also sort of specialty paints. Now, I'm not going to get into all of them. For instance, there's stuff like color shift paints that have like multiple metallic sheens that are viewed from different angles that create different colors, which are pretty cool. There are things like, from Citadel paint, Blood for the Blood God, which just sort of recreates blood. And there are things like rust paints or verdigris and moss, which you will only use in limited spaces and time. But they can be a nice little thing because they can definitely speed up your operation. And if you're looking to create more weathered effects, might be a nice way to go. Another thing are pencils. Now, I personally have not found a great use for pencils yet, but if I'm going to use them, I'm going to use them on much larger surfaces, generally in terrain or rubble areas, or if I want to create scratches, sometimes a pencil can work. Obviously, it has a hard tip, which means that it's a little easier to control in certain places. Or if I want to do writing and make it look like an old worn-torn building with someone writing something, a pencil can work really well. People use it normally for weathering techniques, adding little scratches here and there, which you can all do with your paintbrush. So pencils are really a thing that if you're interested in just trying different stuff out, it could work, but for the most part, you can pretty much avoid it. I realize that there's something that I haven't touched upon as well. Within certain brands, there are going to be things that you're going to see that are going to be something called speed paints or contrast paints or airbrush paints. And these are specifics within lines of different companies that are out there. Now, speed paint and contrast paints are effectively the same type of thing, but they're just from different brands. And what they are designed to do is be applied and for the pigment to fall into the recesses of the miniature, meaning that it creates a sort of definition which you could do in other ways, but helps sort of speed up the process, hence called speed paint or contrast paint. These are things that I hadn't really had much. I've never really practiced or tried using, and I also don't really need to. I've not felt like I've had to go down that road. They are out there, and if you're painting like large batches of things, it might be an interesting way of testing it, but I don't personally have a lot of knowledge with it. Also, when it comes to airbrush paints are acrylic paints that have been pre-thinned to a level that is good for consistency through an airbrush. However, this is something you do not really need. And I say that because what you can do with just your regular acrylic paint is you can thin it down yourself to make it to airbrush viscosity. There's no real need to buy airbrush paint unless you want to spend money. And I would say don't do it. Just buy regular acrylic paint that you like and then thin it down yourself. So we've covered the majority of the different ranges of the different types of medium that are out there. But if you're just starting out, you really want to just narrow it down to acrylic paint. So what are the kind of brands that are out there that should be on your attention or on your radar that you should be possibly picking from? For the most part, you kind of can't really go wrong. However, there are brands out there that specifically make paint for miniatures, okay? And so you go, well, what's the difference between that and say a regular kind of craft paint? The real difference between that is the level of pigment that exists in those paints. Because miniature painting is obviously miniature, we're dealing with very fine details, most people want, an artist grade level of pigment in their paint, meaning that it covers well, it's got, great vibrancy, things that you want when you're painting. And because there's so many different miniature brands out there for terms of paint, picking one of them that is reputable is probably the best place to start, rather than going and buying craft paint, specifically from like your local, supermarket or Target or something along those lines, and trying to paint your miniatures. Yes, you can buy it probably for cheaper, or it would be inexpensive to buy those craft paints, but they're just not going to be as easy or as good as the paints that are out there that are specific for miniature painting. There are a ton of companies out there. Which one? Well, I'm going to go through a bunch of them. I can't go through every single one of them because there's more and more every day creating new things. But I'm going to go through a bunch of good ones, pick the reputable ones out that I'm aware of, and we'll have a discussion about what those things are. I'm going to start with Citadel, or Games Workshop paints. They make great paints. I'm just not going to knock them. They make really good paints. They do tend to be a little bit on the sateen kind of side of things, rather than on the very, very matte. And I do personally prefer the very matte rather than the satin. They are on the more expensive side of things, especially if you buy it directly from Games Workshop, which I would say not to do. However, my biggest drawback with their paints is that they come in these pots. And these pots they're not cool, man. They're not cool. If you don't close them properly, you can obviously dry out your paints, which is not very good. They also, if you knock them over, which is a tendency with these things because you've got to keep the lid open, I just think it's a bad design by them. But I understand they want to be different than the rest of them, so this is how this kind of gets put out. Their paints are great. And one thing, actually, I'd like to make mention about Citadel stuff, which it's a great boon to them. So many people make tutorials with their paints. Their paints are so popular and so well utilized that you can find recipes for painting certain things with their paints so much more easily than practically anyone else's paints out there. Now, I would like to just put a little mark to that, is that you don't necessarily need recipes to get better with painting. It can seem like it can help. It's almost like cooking kind of at first. So at first you might go, okay, I do need it, but you not necessarily, I'll just say. At the end of the day with Citadel, it's a perfectly respectable choice at which you cannot go wrong with. For the next one though, I'm gonna go to Monument Pro Acrylic line. They're a much more newer paint company from what I can tell. They have a huge range of paints out there. Their paints tend to be a bit more on the matter side, which is great in my opinion. They also have little agitator balls in them, which means that they're great for mixing. And because of their massive range, they have all the colors that you're going to need. They are a little bit more expensive than say some other brands that are out there, but they make a good paint range, and I would recommend them as a thing. In America especially, they're easy to get. You can order directly from them, and I think that's a good company to go for. Next up is going to be Scale 75. Now, I think they're a Spanish company that has warehouse here in America, and you can buy their paints. Scale 75 is a big company. They've got a variety of different paints that exist in their line. However, the important part of it is that their paints are very matte, and that can be quite a nice thing depending on what you're looking for. However, some of their paints have a tendency to be a bit I don't know, sludge, heavy, hard to use. Not hard to use, more like their paints can get clogged a little bit inside their bottles. However, inside their line, they also have tube paints like this, which are much more like your classic oil paints that you can get. Now, tube paints are nice. They feel like oil in a certain way. I mean, not in an application, I mean purely on a cosmetic standpoint inside a tube. However, for storage purposes, bottles and stuff like that are so much more easy to have around than tubes. So personally, prefer the bottles rather than these, but Scale 75 make nice colors, lots of choices just like most of the other colors, and if you're looking for a very matte finish, they will do the trick. Another company that I would like to recommend, which I don't actually have any of their paints, but I have used a few of them, is Army Painter. Now, Army Painter perhaps might be the very best paint to get for beginners. And let me put a caveat on this specific thing. Firstly, Army Painter paints are inexpensive. You can buy a lot of them for not as much money. You can spend something around $90 or $100 to get something like 50 paints. That will do a huge range of things for you. And so one of the toughest things about starting out when buying paint is what colors to buy. And when you don't know what colors to buy, you kind of want to get a whole lot of them because then you're experimenting with them. So Army Painter does a wonderful job of making it cost effective and buying a lot of paint in one go. My only knock to Army Painter paint is that I think they're not quite as good as some of these other companies that are out there in terms of its coverage or its level of opacity to it. I prefer Monument Paints personally to Army Paint stuff, but for bang for buck, it's tough to beat the Army Painter stuff. I'm going to talk about Vallejo paints briefly. Vallejo paints are from Spain, and they make really top quality paints. Now, Vallejo paints are something cool about them is that they are quite inexpensive. You know, I think they're in the same territory as Army Painter in terms of the price that you get. And there are professionals out there that use it. If high-level artist painters are out there using Vallejo paint, that says something about the product that they are making. So there's just something out there to keep your eyes upon in terms of a paint brand out there that you might want to go and pick up. It might be harder to find Vallejo paints in your local store, but you can easily buy them online or on Amazon. There's one brand I totally forgot to talk about, and the reason why I forgot to talk about it is because they're not a miniature painting brand. They are a fine art brand, and that fine art brand, which I have no paints to show you here, is called Golden. Golden heavy body acrylic paints are comparable and are high top quality paints that you can get, which may be just as good as any paint that are out there. I don't have first-hand experience with them, really, but I know people who have used them in the fine arts world who love their paints. I've seen also videos about miniature painters who use or who have used Golden. The thing about Golden is they're probably on the more expensive side versus a variety of other things. They're going to probably come in slightly bigger tubes because they are more designed for the fine arts, like canvas painting, rather than for the miniature territory. So you will spend more money probably per individual like tube than say what you might buy on regular acrylic paints that are out there. The cool thing though about Golden is that they think of it much more like oil paints or much more attuned to that style of thing. So you can get stuff that's like cadmium paints. They are toxic, so you got to be careful with that stuff. But there are colors that are associated with oil and fine art stuff. So you got a huge range of interesting colors that exist out there. My feeling is that if they operate more like not like oils, but more, I think they're going to operate a bit more like Kimera stuff. Maybe a little harder to use for beginners because they're probably not making their paints quite as universally cohesive as, say, another brand might, who are specifically doing it for like, I don't know, like normal painters. It's like the wrong word. Your casual painters. And then lastly, on the sort of acrylic front, I think, is going to be Kimera, this stuff right here. This is the paint that I use. It's tough to really begin about why I like it so much. I would start with saying that they're in a nice container. They have an agitated ball, so you can just shake them out and get them to be properly mixed. They have a lovely level of mattness to them, which works for me. They are a mixer's paint. Like, if you like mixing colors together, Kimera stuff is really good. I don't necessarily recommend them as beginner paints. They just take a bit more effort, a bit more work to kind of use them. And they have certain properties about them which are not exactly beginner friendly. Some of their paints have strange levels of opacity to them, or levels of transparency, which you have to learn to get accustomed with, where in most other lines, they try to balance all of those things out across their entire range of colors, whereas Kimera doesn't care about that. They're not trying to do that. So you have to conform a bit more to the paint that you're using rather than the brand trying to make their paints all level and balanced in a certain sense. However, I really like them. They are from Italy. They're a bit more expensive and they are a little, if not a fair bit harder to get. So in terms of like paints that are out there that are easy to get, Army Painter, Monument stuff, Scale 75, and Citadel, all great paints that are out there that you can readily get. There are a ton more paint lines out there, and I don't have personal use with every single one of them. There are several companies out there that are of note, though, that perhaps you should be aware of. For instance, there's P3. They utilize a bottle much more like Citadel, which I'm not so for, but they make good quality paints. There is also Reaper Master Paint Series, which make supposedly good paints as well, but I haven't tried it. I know of Two Thin Coats. This is from a gentleman named Duncan Rhodes, who used to be like the head painter, not the head painter, but the face of painting for Games Workshop, and who's created his own paint line out there. But I haven't had a whole lot of use with any of those particular ones, so you're going to have to do a little research to determine if it will work best for you. If you've had experience with some of those paints that I am less accustomed to, and you want to share your use, your history with them, please, by all means, drop them in the comments for anyone who's, watching this video, to hopefully give them a sense about what good paints that are out there, or from the brands that I particularly missed. I want to give just a tiny little minor story, I think, or maybe history of my own painting and how I kind of gotten to where I have gone, or how I've gotten to where I'm going, which I haven't gotten to yet, strangely, is I started out on Citadel paints. And those are, obviously, I've already spoken about them. And through experimentation, I have gone to other paint brands that are out there. And I think this happens to everyone. Paints are expensive. Not that each one individual thing is particularly expensive. It's that when you're buying ranges of things, there are like 100 different paints, it can be very expensive. Buying paints or other paints aren't going to make you a better painter. I wish they could, but it doesn't really work like that. Now, it might be something that gives you like, I want to try it, and it might be a muse to test something different out. That's absolutely possible. But likely, the paints that you've got, or the paints that you maybe are going to get, sticking with those things is a means of understanding the medium that you have. And learning to understand that now becomes the benchmark of how you determine other paints. If you start getting one paint and then you immediately switch to another thing, you're not giving yourself enough time to truly understand the tool that you have in front of you. So picking a reputable brand is a great place to start. Once you feel like you're confident or you've gotten a great sense about it, then it may be time to move on. But obviously, we're all within financial discretion about what you have available to you. You don't need to. Sticking with one thing can be absolutely be the thing you need to do. You don't need to spend all this, amounts of money just because a new paint has come about. And with that, I think I'm done. So I'm going to say goodbye. If you liked what I had to tell you guys about and just showing you these things, please, subscribe. We're going to have more videos like the video, because there's going to be more videos and stuff about that, where we're going to diving in deeply into each different part of the topic that is miniature painting. I'm signing off. See you guys later.